you so much.
This exhibition of portraits and oral histories began in 1987 with my desire to help bridge the divide that existed at that time between loggers and environmentalists. So I'm really grateful for the chance to sort of resurrect this old work and bring it to the museum here, and it's going to travel around because across the country today we again live in times of deep division, and I believe in the power of stories that reflect our shared humanity to help us see beyond those divides. It was 1933, in the middle of the Great Depression. A 14-year-old Lars Sanders in northern Minnesota was so excited he could not get to sleep because the next day he was not going to school. Instead, he was going to work with his dad in the woods. The next morning, his dad gave him an axe. He began to teach him how to use it. He taught him to hold the axe, how to stand, how to swing. But he said, "Son, the most important thing to remember is before you swing, you pick your mark on the limb where you want the axe to land. And during the swing, you never, ever take your eye off that mark." They went to work. His father felled the trees, and Lars began to chop the limbs off the trees his father fell. At first, Lars' movements were really awkward and stiff. And as the day wore on, he found a rhythm and his body relaxed until that afternoon. He picked his mark and he started a swing, and something distracted his eye, and the axe glanced off the limb and came down into his calf, cut him really badly, and he screamed. His father ran over and he picked him up onto the log, and he set him there, and his father ripped the sleeve off his shirt and tied a tourniquet around his leg. And while the wound began to slow down bleeding, then he reached down and got some snow and packed the wound in snow, and then he went back to work for a little while to let the snow do its job. He came back a few minutes later, cleared the snow away, the bleeding had stopped, and he very calmly pulled a needle and thread out of a kit in his pocket. And as he stitched up his son's legs, he said, "Lars, you've got the sap of these trees in your veins now. You'll be in the woods the rest of your life." And he was. Fast forward 44 years, and Lars took his 16-year-old son, Ross, out to work with him in the woods. Handed him a chainsaw, taught him how to use it, and they went to work. Lars felled the trees, and Ross cut the limbs off the trees his father fell. Day 1 went well. Day 2 went well. On day 3, he revved that saw, put it into the limb, and the limb had a real bind in it, and it rejected the saw and kicked it back, and it tore across his knee and his thigh. Ross screamed. His father came over, and Lars ripped the sleeve off his shirt, tied a tourniquet around his leg, put him in the truck, and on the way to the hospital, he said, "Son, you've got the sap of these trees in your veins now. You'll be in the woods the rest of your life." Well, Ross is 66 years old, still working in the woods. This is his cork boot. I met Ross in 1973 on a trip to the Sierras, and I met him, and he and I we hit it off. We liked each other a lot right away, and I was telling him that I had been looking for an adventurous way to make a lot of money in a short period of time because the photo school I selected was really, really expensive. So he said, "You know, it's springtime, and there's a lot of work in the woods here right now. Why don't you come up here? I bet I can find you a job." It took me about half a second to say, "Hell yeah." So I drove back to LA, and I packed up my apartment and moved back up to the Sierras and got there on Sunday evening, and I called him, and he said, "I've got a job starting tomorrow morning with my dad." So his father Lars had gotten this little 2-week real simple job, which was great for me, not a high-wheeling deal. And so I went out with Lars, and he was a fabulous teacher. But more importantly than that is that he never, ever made me feel stupid. And I gave him ample opportunity to make me feel stupid because I grew up in the suburbs of LA, and here I am in the Sierras. I don't know anything, but I don't know the difference between a fir, a pine, or a cedar. I don't know anything about the tools or the machines. My hands are baby butt soft, and I showed up on the first day wearing tennis shoes. So at the end of the 2 weeks, it's sort of like my initiation or boot camp or orientation. Evidently, I showed some potential, and Lars was able to recommend a job for me to a Jippo logger. And so I worked the rest of the summer and discovered that I absolutely loved it. I loved the physicality of the work. I loved the danger, but more I loved that camaraderie that came with danger and relying on one another to stay safe and to stay alive. So I called up my photo school and said, I'm having too much fun, postpone my enrollment. And 1 year turned into 4 years of setting chokers, bumping knots, and working as a cat skinner. How different than the suburbs of LA, right? So on my very last Friday evening at the White Pines Lodge, the whole crew went for a beer, and our side rod bought a round of beers for everybody, and he began to roast me. And he finished by saying, David, good luck in photo school, and please don't forget us dirty old loggers. Well, I went to photo school, I graduated, I started a career, and for 10 years I did forget the dirty old loggers until I started reading articles in the LA Times about the Spotted Owl Wars. And I realized, you know, maybe I have a perspective here that could be of some value. And I found a Mendocino County Museum in Willits that was very eager to collaborate with me and create. They have a strong oral history program. We really wanted to focus on the lunch bucket crew, the guys working on the ground, loving what they do, that just followed in fathers and grandfathers' footsteps and stay out of the political and the power structure of how and how much and who decided all of that. So this is what we did. So this is a photograph of Ross from the back, and I titled it Board Meeting, not at all to be cute, but that's in actuality what is going on. This is his timber falling crew, and it's a Friday afternoon, and they're having a meeting talking about like a week in review. You know, how did it go, what did we improve, and things to look out for in the following week. Two of his timber fallers, Randy Shull and John McGarry. Larry Caswell. And Harry Brundage, a choker setter. Ken Crook and Donald Denham, knot bumpers. And Mark Walker. I made this picture of Mark Walker at his kitchen table in a house that he built by himself, and the time I made this picture, he was 96 years old, living alone, taking care of himself all alone, and I enjoyed the couple of days that I spent just absorbing every story he had to tell, and there were many. And the thread that ran through his entire life story was an incredible sense of curiosity. In a variety of ways, in a variety of subject matters, he was so curious, and it was really, really fascinating. So he graduated at 14 years old and went to a tan bark camp and peeled bark off of tan oak trees, and then decided he wanted to do something different, and he wanted to travel for 2 years, going to all of his relatives' homesteads and working on their homesteads and recording their stories of traveling across the country on covered wagons and homesteading and making new lives in a strange place. So one story that he told me, he learned how to make a fiddle out of cordwood from one uncle, and on another homestead from another uncle, he learned how they kept track of miles traveling across the country in a covered wagon. So the designated mileage keeper for the day would in the morning put a big vest on that had 2 pockets, and the left pocket would be filled with pebbles and the right pocket empty. And they'd sit in the lead wagon, and there was a rag tied to the spoke of the wheel. And every 100 revolutions of that rag, a pebble would go from the left pocket to the right pocket. And at the end of the day, obviously, they did the arithmetic, and guess what? Just like Google Maps, they knew how far they had traveled and how many miles to the next town or water or mountain range. Another Mark Walker story, in his 60s, he and his wife had a best friend named Ina, And the three of them did everything together. And then his wife got sick and died. And Mark and Ina continued the friendship. And on a Tuesday afternoon, sitting at the same kitchen table, Mark is sitting there with Ina. He's staring into his cup of coffee, and he mumbles, "Well, I suppose I ought to find me another old lady to hitch up with." Ina's across the table, and she says, "Well, Mark, I suppose I might kind of like to be that old lady." On Saturday, they were married. This is Ilmar Alto. His nickname, everybody just called him Imp. And his parents immigrated from Finland, and he told me, "You can always tell a Finn out in the woods because our hard hats don't sit straight on our head. They always tilt for some reason." He started felling the giant redwoods on the Mendocino coast when he was 17 years old with the axe and crosscut saw. And he worked as a chopper till he was 72 years old. So when he was 17, he told me they never, ever thought they would run out of those giant trees. He said there weren't even roads over ridges that went on and on and on with these giant trees. And when he was 72 and he quit, he said, "There's nothing but little suckers left now." He quit at 72 because his wife's Alzheimer's had gotten so bad that she would leave the house and wander and not know her way back, not know her name. And so he quit working and stayed at home and took care of her at home until she passed away. Another Finn, Andrew Kajankoski, he's a chopper. Dan Weisner, he's a cat skinner. On the other side of the Coast Range, that was fog, this is dust. Dick Hagedorn, a lot of people have asked me what he's doing. He's a timber faller, and he's using these two 10-ton hydraulic jacks to lift a tree that is leaned out over the riparian zone or the creek areas, which you can't fall the trees into that area. So with these jacks, he can actually lift that tree up and make it fall the opposite direction that it leans naturally. And this is Dick and his wife at home in the afternoon. They often sit out there and have a beer, and this same bird comes down and sips Budweiser out of her can every time. Oh, to be young enough to sleep on a bed of rocks, right? Or nap. This is Donald Denham, the knot bumper from before. A story from my time, we had a choker setter on my crew who got married during the summer. Young guy, got married. And before he got married, his lunches were absolutely boring. 2 slices of white bread, a piece of bologna, some bags of chips and pretzels and candy bars, right? So he gets married, comes back from his long weekend honeymoon, and oh my, he opened that lunch bucket and things had changed. These great big multi-layered sandwiches, meat and cheese and more cheese and lettuce and tomato, homemade cookies. She'd cut up fruit and peel it and put it in these glass jars, and then little tiny folded up love notes. Oh my gosh. We teased him mercilessly. I think he kind of liked it. So about 2 weeks of these honeymoon lunches, and we're driving home in the Crummy after work one day, and Ron slams on the brakes on the Crummy, and we all jump out. And there's a tarantula crawling across the road. So we thought we'd get the tarantula off the road because there was a log truck coming behind us and we knew the tarantula would not survive. But not the newlywed. He had a totally different idea. He ran back to his lunch bucket and he got that glass jar and he comes up and he scoops the tarantula into the glass jar. You know where this is going, right? Puts it in his lunchbox and he's telling us, "Oh man, this is going to be great. Every day I get home and my wife," and that was still new saying my wife, he really loved that part. "My wife cleans out my lunch bucket while I'm in the shower, and she's scared to death of spiders. It's going to be really, really funny." And we're all like, "No, don't do that. Your great big sandwiches, those homemade cookies, not a good idea." Well, you've heard the phrase young and dumb? Well, he did it. And guess who made his own lunches the rest of the summer? This is Stuart Titus, 5th generation logger in the Fort Bragg area. Every day at lunch, he'd look at me and he'd grin, and then he'd say, "Want a Mexican strawberry?" And of course, they were these hotter than hell jalapeno peppers. I tried it once, and that was enough. So Manny lost his arm in a picture, in a situation similar to this picture. The cat had pulled in a big log, and he was reaching across the end of the log to unhook the choker, and he needed a little more slack. And so he reached up and he signaled to the cat skinner to back up a little bit. And the cat skinner was real new. And he throttled way up and popped the clutch at the same time, and that huge D8 cat lurched back, and the big steel housing around the winch slammed against the end of the log with Manny's arm in between. And when they pulled the cat forward, Manny's arm fell to the ground. So it took many months, a long time for him to heal up and to find a prosthetic device that would enable him to use a chainsaw again. And when he finally came back to work, it took him a month or so, but he was just as proficient as before, and he just loved being out there with the guys. So he told me one day that he loved trout and trout fishing, but he couldn't manage that since his accident. So I invited him over to my house one Sunday afternoon for a trout dinner. He arrived with a 6-pack of beer and Mexican strawberries. They go with everything, he said. So we have this trout dinner, and we're all done, and then he looks down at the table, and he kind of got quiet, and he said, I'm really sorry. And he said, "You know, I never even go out to eat anymore because I just make such a mess. It looks like a 3-year-old sat here, and I get so embarrassed." Blew me away. This is James Lee Wilson. And Lee Wilson, they're friends but not related. Jake Gregg, he's a timber faller. He's getting a face full of chips. Normally you would never fall a tree up that high because you would just waste 3-4 feet of lumber. But in this case, there are 2 trees that have grown together, and so he's got to get up above where those trees divide to be able to fall the trees safely. Here he's using an axe like a plumb, so he can hold the axe and real gently hang in a straight line, and then you can see which way the tree leans against that straight line. So this is Ross Sanders, and here's the story how he became my brother-in-law. My sister Donna in mid-high school decided that she wanted to leave LA and move up to the Sierras and live with our mother and our sister. And before she left, her high school sweetheart gave her this tearful goodbye note in which he wrote, "You're probably going to move up there and fall in love with some lumberjack and never come back to me." So she went up to the new high school and didn't really fit in, and had some really bad dates that she didn't enjoy, weren't her type of date, which she described like this. The boy would pick you up in a pickup truck filled with firewood and beer, and you'd go out to the woods, meet other kids, build a huge fire. Most of the boys would get drunk, and the girls would have to drive them home. She didn't really like that. So after a particularly bad one of these dates, she woke up on Sunday morning, and she looked herself in the mirror, and she said, "Donna, you are never going on another date until the boy asks you to dinner and a movie." And then she threw in, "And he's got to drive a sports car." Well, there's a high bar. So a couple of months go by, and she's working at the Giant Burger in town, and from behind the counter where she worked, she could see the parking lot and Highway 4, the main drag through Arnold, so she could see everything coming and going. And she sees a logger's pickup truck pull in, and no big deal, that happens all the time. And the guy walks in the door, and he's this work-dirty young logger, and it's his turn. He walks up and places his order, and he looks at her, and she looks at him, and there's kind of this little spark, you know, and he pays for his food, and he leaves. About an hour goes by, and it's a little busier. Donna's got a couple of families she's helping, and she sees this little black car pull into the parking lot. A couple minutes later, this young guy walks in the door and stands at the end of the line, and he's got this thick head of curly hair and she's looking at him, and she's making orders. She keeps looking. She goes, oh my God, it's that logger from before. Her heart, Anyway, so it's his turn. He walks up. He says, hi, my name is Ross Sanders. Would you like to go to dinner and a movie with me this weekend? And they've been married 45 years. But I got to tell you, that little black car, it wasn't just any little black car. It was his little black car, and it was a 1957 Ford Thunderbird, red upholstery, and the porthole windows on the side. I mean, right, doesn't get better than that, right? This is their son, Luke, and Lars, his grandson, and Luke is operating a rubber-tired skidder with grapples. Now, this kind of light, is often seen with beautiful scenery, picture postcards, and I could be faulted for romanticizing the subject matter, but in fact, I'm really not, because when the equipment runs back and forth on skid trails, it dries that soil out, and it gets so dry in the dog days of summer, it just hangs in the air, and the light comes through it, and it is beautiful, but that dirt gets in your lungs, it's in your ears, in your eyes, your face gets filthy, and there's really nothing romantic about it. This is Luke's dog, and Luke inherited his dog from Lars. Lars trained Tuffy to be his timber faller working companion dog, and this dog knew and could identify and fetch on command the axe, the wedges, the gas jug, the oil jug, the water jug, and he was the most passionate logger, bar none, that I ever saw out in the woods. He would be out there all day, 11 hours a day, working, going from riding up in the loader, loading trucks, to chasing Luke in the skidder, to helping Ross fall a tree. He would bark and bark and bark at that tree, and the tree would come down. He'd jump on top of it, and he'd rip the bark off of it. It was really a sight to behold. This is Rick Fisher. He's a Jippo logger, and he was a logger with a stellar reputation. He just had so much pride. He would go above and beyond what was required. So the water barring on the skid trails was immaculate. The landings were clean. Everybody respected, from employers to the people that contracted with him. And 2 years after I made this photograph, something went wrong in falling a tree, and he was killed. Jim Nelson is a solid, salt-of-the-earth kind of guy. He said, I love to put in a good day's work for a good day's wages. He was paid scale. Fallers at that time in that area were paid scale, meaning they were paid by the board foot of timber that they cut. The masking tape on his hard hat is how he kept track of that. So he would, his little numerical system there would keep track of the quantity of logs, the length of the logs, and the diameter of the logs. So on Friday afternoon, he would just unpeel the masking tape, do a little calculating, and he knew what to expect in his paycheck. So I asked him if I could come home with him one time and meet his family and make some family portraits and photograph him at home. And he said, well, yes, but there's something you should know. 3 years ago, my wife got heavily involved in taking drugs, and she just suddenly disappeared and left us all. And we haven't heard a word from her. We don't know where she is. We really don't even know if she's alive. So I just wanted you to know before you met the kids. So I went home, and this is a portrait that's Jim and Jim Jr., Rachel, and Amber is wearing her father's hard hat. So Jim described a typical day as a single-parent timber faller. He'd get up at 4 in the morning, and he'd make all their lunches, and then he would wake up each child, carry them out to the truck, put them in the truck, get their backpacks and schoolwork, and then he would drive to the sitter's house, and the sitter had sleeping bags laid out on the floor for each of them. He'd carry them each and get them settled in a sleeping bag with their backpacks, and then he would drive an hour or so off and work all day as a timber faller, then drive home and be there about time the bus arrived. Then he would oversee homework and chores for the afternoon and then fix dinner. And then after dinner, he preferred, usually that time period, preferred doing what he called domestics, so laundry and things around the house that he didn't want to do on the weekend because he loved going up to the high lakes and go camping and fishing and swimming with the kids. Then after the kids went to bed, then he would clean his saws, file his chains, and refill the gas and oil jugs and be in bed about 10. This is Jim falling a ponderosa pine, also referred to as a yellow pine. And about 4 months before the exhibition in '89, I was making this print in the darkroom, and it was really calling to me. It was speaking to me, and it took me a while to really listen and get it. But I was sort of looking at it, and it's like, and then I kind of reached out and just put my hand over the print and blocked Jim out of the image. And I thought, that's it. I want to make some pictures that are different than the documentary style. I want to photograph this tragically beautiful moment of transition between life and death. And I want to photograph it in a timeless way, so I didn't want the logger in there. And I wanted to be more poetic and more visual than the straight-ahead documentary style. So this is a series of work I call Falling Trees. The way I made these trees is interesting to quite a few people. I won't get real technical photographic, but I called Ross, told him what I wanted to do, and he said, yes, come on up on a Saturday because the crew's not working because we'll be working really slowly. So he would find a tree that was marked by the Forest Service because it was all selective cut logging, and he would do his thing with the axe and seeing which side was weighted with more limbs and the wind, and he'd say, okay, it's going down over there between that thicket of saplings and that outcropping of rocks. Then I would go around doing my photographer's thing, trying to imagine the tree falling and trying to find the best place that a photograph would be of something that has not yet happened. So once I would do that, I would set up this big 4x5 camera, the kind you have the cloth over your head with all the gears and stuff. I'd set up the big camera, then I'd choose which lens. And then the next most challenging creative decision to make was shutter speed, motion. So photographing motion is always a calculated guessing game. And so anyway, I would go through that, and the last thing I would do is I'd look through the camera again, and I would embed the 4 edges of the frame in my mind, because with this kind of camera, once you put the film in, you can't see through the lens anymore. So I would do that, pull the dark slide on the film, and then signal to Ross to go ahead, and then the tree would start to come. I'd be watching, and okay, now, and I'd trigger the shutter. So there was a lot of excitement from the magic and mystery of having no idea what I was going to get out of these 26 sheets of film that I photographed on that day. So this is one time where I had the camera right down low at the base of the tree looking up. And when a tree goes down like this, it brushes by trees that are still standing, and those standing trees are going like this. Sometimes limbs break off. They call them widowmakers. But there's a lot of debris. Needles and stuff are falling. So you need to be real careful. So I'm down like this, and I'm watching, and I had taken the... And then I look down at the camera, and I see my big, beautiful lens, this big piece of glass, the heart and soul of photographer's equipment. And so I took my hard hat off and I put it over the lens. And I go, wait a minute. What's replaceable here? So now, fast forward 15 years, it's 2003, and my book Urban Forest had come out, and I had an appointment to meet with Karen Sinsheimer, the curator of photography at the Santa Barbara Museum of Art. She collected my work and supported me in ways. So we had this meeting, and she told me that she was now on the board of directors at the California State History Museum in Sacramento. And she said, have you ever thought of retracing your steps from the 1988 project and photographing the loggers to see what was different? And if you'd be interested, I could probably arrange an exhibition at the History Museum from the '88 and the 2004 images. And What do you say? Of course, yes, absolutely, I will. So in 2004, in September, I had a storefront portrait studio at that time, and I completely locked it up for an entire month and traveled through the Sierras, Mount Shasta, Weaverville, and the Redwood Coast, retracing my steps to see what had changed. And the single biggest difference you might imagine was technology and mechanical logging. And of the new machines, the Feller Buncher was, to me, the one that was sort of quintessential difference between the time periods. So the Feller Buncher machine, the image on the right, it goes up to a standing tree, and it grabs that whole tree, and there's a saw that comes off below the grapples and cuts the tree off. It lifts up the entire tree, swivels over, and it throws that tree into a pile called a doodle. So other new machines that had arrived, there was a delimber and a dangle head, and these machines had a few effects. One is obviously they increased productivity and efficiency and also safety, and they also reduced the workforce. And they also changed things in another way, kind of a wild way, I think, of it. As so often these machines now had enclosed cabs, and so the men could sit inside, and they had heat in the winter and AC in the summer. They could have their iPads and listen to music. So it was really different that way. So here's another example of how these times had changed. I made these two lunchtime photographs 24 hours apart. So the crew on the left is Ross and his crew, which at this point in time is now a salvage logging crew. They have a unique situation where the landowners have an infestation of bugs or disease in their forest. And Ross's small crew is highly mobile, and so they'll go in like a surgical team, cut out all those bug-infested trees and get them out of the woods in the same day or two, and then to keep the disease from spreading. So this is typical how you would eat lunch on logging crews from and so the very next day I'm at this mechanical crew, and I'm standing there at lunchtime talking to them because mostly all morning they had been up in the cabs and I really didn't get a chance. But in the back of my mind, I'm having these questions and talking to them. I'm thinking, there's something really wrong here. And then I realized they're standing up. So I said, how come you guys are standing up? And they looked at me like that was the stupidest question on earth. Because we sit all day for 11 hours a day. And I went, oh. And then I realized, that's why your shirts are also so clean, and your faces are so clean, and you're not maybe as physically fit as the other guys. This is Thomas Duarte. He's the Feller Buncher operator. I asked him how he got started in the woods, and he said, well, I graduated high school, and I sat around for a couple of weeks. I didn't make any plans. I really wasn't looking for work. And my logger dad came home and said, bad news, good news. Bad news, you got to move out or pay rent. Good news, I got you a job and you start tomorrow. So I was really curious about this machine. He invited me into the cab, and I sat down in the chair. And so the machine has 2 foot pedals, and it's got 2 joysticks that go back and forth and sideways. And on top of the joysticks are 2 handles with thumb buttons, like video gaming machine. And so this machine, I mean, he sits there and the feet are doing things, the joysticks, the thumbs are doing, and the machine articulates, it moves, it goes up and down, it swivels, it tilts, it does. It's pretty amazing. So I just kept question after question about doing this, and at some point in that, he said, well, in the morning I get in and I do have to kind of think about what I'm doing. I've got to concentrate, pay attention for a while, but then eventually I just warm up and the machine just becomes me. I thought that was really interesting. So I noticed when I walked inside the cab that, I was out there in this pine-scented forest and all the earthy smells, and I get in the cab and it's just this, diesel and grease, and so I'm photographing his tree-scented tree, and he chuckles behind me, the duality of man. This is Tristan Allen. He's one of the owners of these mechanical logging companies, and he's unique because he actually grew up in a farming family, not a logging family. So he got a bachelor's degree in agriculture at UC Davis, and then he went on to get a master's in business, and the family was, oh yes, he's going to take our farm to the enterprise future, And then he graduated with his MBA, and decided he loved mechanical logging. And so he got into mechanical logging, loans to the hilt to buy these $250,000 machines. And he loved the whole process of keeping it all going and the excitement of all of that. And I found it kind of interesting, this technologically, mechanically future guy, his dashboard was covered in Post-it notes for things that he needed to do. Everybody loves this. Ben Kringle, I work in the woods because I don't like people. You got your picture, we're done. And off he drove. Robert Ambrosini, so he really is a happy-go-lucky guy, like the complete opposite of Ben from before. So his childhood nickname, Booger, lasted all the way into lifetime, so into his adulthood. So I made this picture just as he was telling me the story of how he lost his front teeth. Do you know? You want to guess? He woke up in the cab of his truck in the parking lot of the White Pines Lodge on Sunday morning. His shirt was bloody, his teeth were missing, and he didn't remember anything else of the night before. This is Ron Rector, and that's a loader behind him. He's a loader operator, and he was a loader operator when I worked. He loved being the loader operator, he said, because the logs come into the landing, he decks them, the logs go on the truck out of the landing, and he loved that feeling of being in the center of everything. So Ron also drove the Crummy. So one morning, 4:30 in the morning, we're driving to work, Ron's driving the Crummy, and we're all asleep, and all of a sudden he wakes us up saying, "What the hell are those two lights?" And he slams on the brakes, pulls to the side of the road, and we all get out. So we're in this long straightaway going down the Sierras in this big open area, ranch on both sides, and we can look out all over the Central Valley, and in front of us was the city of Stockton. And these two large round lights are over the city of Stockton, but they were way too high to be any part of Stockton at all, and too big for stars and planets or anything like that. So we're all just like 4:30 in the morning, we're standing there making up all these wackadoodle theories about what it might be for about 10 minutes, and then the two lights just started moving toward each other, and then they perfectly either overlapped or merged into one light for about a minute, and then was gone. We just stood there in slack-jawed silence like, whoa. The next day, in the newspapers, all up and down the state of California, night duty policemen, nurses, workers saw the same thing in different cities all over the California. And the Air Force official was, yes, we know about them, we saw them, we don't know what they were, no further comment. Yeah. This is Don Rector, Ron's brother. He's loading the chip truck to go to the cogen plant, which creates electricity to run one of the mills. John McGarry cleverly put a tattoo over his scar to remind himself to be safe. Bill Farmer, a cat skinner. This is Pat Prest. I set chokers behind Pat Prest for just a couple of weeks. He ran a rubber-tired skidder with grapples on it, but the grapples were in the shop. So I was setting a choker under a log, and I felt some resistance, which was pretty normal. They didn't always go all the way through. So I went around the log with my choker shovel, fully expecting to just dig out the nubbin and pull the choker through. When I went around, I met up with a rattlesnake who was up and started rattling and then lunged at me, and I whacked it with the choker shovel before it got me, and then once more just to be sure. And then Pat came in with the skidder, and I'm still kind of like shocked, and I hold up the snake, and I kind of expect a, are you okay? Did you get bit? Instead, he got this great big grin, and he waves me over, and he said, jump on, and bring the snake. So I get on the little step, and then I'm holding on, and I'm holding the snake, and we ride into the landing, and Bobby up in the loader sees us coming in without any logs, and I'm holding the snake, and he gets this great big grin. So obviously they knew something I didn't. We get in this huddle, and we plan this prank, because the next log truck in the landing the driver is Doyle. and Doyle is deathly afraid of snakes. So Bobby takes me over and tells me exactly in the landing where to coil the snake. And then he jumps up in the loader and he radios for Doyle to back the truck in. So we're all hanging back and watching, and the truck backs in, and Bobby's like, come, stop, right over the, So Doyle was an absolute character, and he had this routine that he did every single time he got out of his truck in the landing. He would open the door of the landing, and I got to tell you, so he is a James Dean wannabe lookalike. So he would wear the blue jeans with the little cuffed up, rolled up thing, and the white t-shirt with the Marlboro rolled up in the sleeves. So his routine, he'd open the door, and then he'd step out onto, there was a step above the diesel tank, and he'd stand on that, and then he'd like scan the whole landing, as if it were a Hollywood set and the camera was rolling. The cameras are rolling, right? So he scanned, and then he ceremoniously pulls out his comb, and he combs that perfect James Dean hairdo, with the little ducktail in the back. He puts the comb back in, and he steps off, and he looks at the snake, and he turns from absolutely cool truck driver to absolutely panic-stricken truck driver, screaming, running out of the landing, and we're all splitting a gut. It was great. When I made this picture, we're leaning on the bed of the pickup truck, and Pat was telling me about his accident that happened that was very evident to me before we even talked, because every step that he took was awkward and limping and contorted and obviously really painful. And we were talking about it, and he had been hit by a tree 2 years before and airlifted out of the woods, and he was in the hospital for 2 months while they tried to patch him together. And he said, I'm so grateful for Tom and the guys to patch together different jobs so that I can be out here working and be physical and be useful. And he said, as long as I'm working, the pain is manageable. I don't really think about it. But in the winters, when I'm not working and I'm not with the guys, the pain is just unbearable. So I made a print for every person that I photographed and sent everybody a print and a thank you note. And Pat was the only person who sent a thank you note for my thank you note. And in it, he just wrote a really sweet thing about being grateful that I came out and paid attention to these dirty old loggers and listened to their stories and recorded them and their work. And so this card, I still have it. It's a Hallmark-like card, this bright sun with these rays down through a blue sky, and one little tiny daisy coming up out of the ground. And the winter after I got that card, he ended his own life. This is Donald Bruce Cash. He's a knot bumper. Rick Martin. Rick was the youngest of 2 sons of Tom Martin, who was the Jippo logger that I worked for most of my years in the woods. And this is Tom. Tom was retired when I was making these pictures, so I met him at the shop. And he's a man of few words, so the interview is like, that long. And Tom was a great guy to work for in a lot of ways, and smart. He paid more than every other Jippo logger, which meant he had the highest skilled crew and the most loyal. Guys on the crew that his son is running now have been working together 25 years. And another thing about Tom is that everybody on the crew knew if you got into a dangerous situation or some situation that he had your back. He would either figure out a way around it or he would do it himself, and he would do it without ever making you feel like you were a coward or less than a good, honest logger. So an example of that is a story that happened before I worked that I heard from the guys. Tony, the cat skinner, had gotten a cat on a big boulder ledge, and it was kind of stuck there. So the whole crew and Tom came out and were trying to figure out what they were going to do. And finally Tom said, I see 2 options. Leave it there to rust or take it over the edge. And with that, he walked toward the cat, and he got in it, and he started fumbling around. We didn't know quite what, and he found the seat belt, which no one ever used the seat belt. He buckled it, cinched it, put it into forward gear, and it went over that edge and down and bounced along rocks and then flipped over on its side. And he got up out of it, walked to the crew, and said, "Now get the other cat and winch that thing back up on its tracks," and walked away. Another story in the same vein, very different. We had a guy work for us. His name was Desi. Big bear of a guy, big full beard, huge hands, arms, and he was a heavyweight Golden Gloves boxer. His name was Desi. And Tom's oldest son, Bobby, had taken a few karate classes and sometimes pushed things a little too far. So we're at the White Pines Lodge having some beers on Friday evening, and Bobby reached over and tugged on Desi's beard. Desi just kind of swatted his hand away and said, "Knock it off." Another beer later, Bobby reaches over and tugs on his beard again. And Desi turns to him and says, loud enough for the whole crew to hear, he says, "Damn it, Bobby, you pull on my beard one more time, I swear I'm going to deck your ass." Well, the whole rest of the crew goes, "Whoa, you're no match for him, knock it off, we don't want any trouble." Well, another beer later, Bobby reached over and tugged on his beard. In a split second, without even getting off the stool, Desi plowed that huge fist into Bobby's face, sent him flying to the floor. His nose is sideways, blood everywhere. Ron and Pat pick him up, put him in the truck, drive him to the hospital. Somebody else went and called Tom. So Monday morning in the landing, we're all sipping the last of our coffee while the equipment's warming up, and we're all, of course, wondering, is Desi going to get fired? Tom pulls up in the truck. He gets out, stands in front of the crew. He looks Desi right in the eye, and he says, "Suppose Bobby got what he deserved. You boys get some logs and send these trucks down the road." Got in the truck and drove away. Raul Mora-Avalos was a hook tender on a cable yarding crew and didn't speak English, so the side rod was bilingual, and I asked him what he liked most about his workday, and he said, "When I get home and my little girl runs across the room and jumps into my arms and says, 'Hello, sweet daddy.'" So my photographic connection, you can see, is inspired by this whole physical experience. My photographic connection to trees and forests, and I have a lot of bodies of work that explore that theme in a variety of ways. I'm going to leave you with a story today that reveals a kind of spiritual side to that tree-forest connection as well. A month before I was leaving the woods to go to photography school, I had a real unique situation. We had the only clear cut I had seen or worked on, and the ground was really very steep. And on really steep ground, you're supposed to follow the trees either straight up the hill or straight down the hill. Well, before we started up there to begin skidding logs, the faller let us know that one great big sugar pine tree got away from him, and it was sideways to the fall line, meaning it could roll, and to be careful. So the ground was so steep that the cat couldn't go up. And Jerry, my cat skinner, he was a very cautious, safe guy, partly because he had lost an eye in an accident years ago, so he had one good eye and one glass eye, and he was always real careful. Anyway, he would wind the cat way around along this ridge and get right up above me, and then he would come down. So this one time, he comes down and stops the cat right near me and buries the blade in the ground as a kind of precautionary extra break. And then he looks at me, and I give him the hand signals that we used to communicate over the roar of the diesel engine, what logs I was going to take in what order, and that he nodded that he understood. So I walked around, I unhooked the chokers off the butt hook, and set a couple of chokers, and took the third choker over to this big, beautiful, second cut sugar pine log that was 33 feet long. It was 3 feet in diameter, absolutely no taper, not a single limb on it. It was a gorgeous log. Now, a log like that on really steep ground would come to about here on you, on the uphill side, and on the downhill side, it would be like up here. So I had planned what I was going to do, and I had enough years in to know how to do that absolutely safely. And I went up from the uphill side with the choker, and I put the choker under the log, and in that moment, I abandoned my plan. I have no idea why. Maybe it was Friday afternoon, and I was young and strong and facing this whole new exciting thing. I don't know. but I put my hands on top of the log, and I threw my legs over it like a gymnast on a side horse, and I felt the log start to wobble underneath me. When I hit the ground, I was running, and the whole memory is really, really clear, but it's like distilled as a still image in my mind. I don't know how long I ran, but at some point in front of me were nothing but logs and limbs, and I knew in that instant I couldn't run over that without being crushed. I looked over my shoulder, the log was right there, and in a fraction of a second I knew my only chance to survive was to gather momentum, jump in the air. I threw my legs sideways and hoped the log would roll under me. I came down, I was sprawled out on the log as it was going like this to a stop, and I rolled off gently to the uphill side. I sat there, I looked over at Jerry. His mouth was open, his one good eye was huge, and I looked to my left, and there it was, a red fir about this big, the only tree left standing in the middle of that clear cut. So a log nearly killed me, but that tree saved my life. Thank you to the Benton County Museum and to Irene and Mark and Joyce Nesson for recommending me for this exhibit, but mostly thank you to all of you for coming out here today. I'm so grateful that you're here. Thank you very much.